In this series, we cover essential features which our prospective users or existing users have requested to understand in further depth. For this edition, we'll be covering how to use shifts on the PagarBook platform. So I will start with few basic terminologies which some of you might be already aware of, but this is just to get everyone on the same page and get started. So as you would understand that for any attendance system, even if you are using a pen and paper to note down the attendance timing of any staff, there would be certain terminologies associated with it. To start with, you would probably note when an employee has punched in, and this has a couple of consequences. So if there is an early entry or there is a late entry, you would probably make a note of it. Then you would also have certain policies around when people go on a break. So you would note down if somebody has gone for a break and when that person ends the break. This obviously would have some kind of a policy around how long is your break hours, and if somebody exceeds those designated break hours, what are the consequences. And last but not the least, at the end of the day, you would definitely make a note of when somebody punches out, just to understand that if the employee has left early or late, which again can have consequences like fines or overtime. As you would understand that these terms which are marked in bold, right, they need a reference point for any software system to work. So we need to understand when does a shift start in your organization, when does the shift end, what is the break period, and so on, right? So for us, there needs to be some reference point. The associated terms need some sort of a policy around it. So for example, let's take the example of a punch out, right? So if somebody exits early, and let's say there is a grace period of 15 minutes and somebody leaves, let's say around 10 minutes before the end of the shift, right? So would you fine them or would you not fine them? If somebody works for longer hours, would you pay them overtime or not? And so on. So these, like I said, need some sort of a definition of your business policy, right? Now we will see how it is configured in our system, but before that we'll just go through the type of shifts that we covered as part of PagarBook platform. So we have three types of shifts, right? The first one is a basic one. It's a fixed shift where you have an explicit in and out time with certain designated break hours, and a particular employee is mapped to only one shift. So it would look something like this. So in a 24-hour window, you have a start time, you have an end time. The length of this bar is like the length of the shift. You would have some designated break hours. Everybody is mapped to this shift, and so on. Next is rotational shift. It's very similar to fixed shift, just that there could be multiple shifts in a day, right? And an employee can work in either, let's say, the first shift or the second shift or both shift, and so on, right? So one day somebody might be working in as a part of this shift, next day they might be working in that shift, and so on, right? The third is something called an open shift, where basically you don't have an explicit in and out time. You need the staff to be present for X number of hours in the day and clock the time, right? So you would have somebody maybe logging in at 6, completing their 6-hour shift. Somebody might be coming in at 7, somebody might be coming in at 10. The idea is to understand if they have clocked the designated shift hours or not. So now we'll look at how the configuration is done. So under the settings page, within attendance setting, you would first go to shift setting. Here you can add shift, and so let's say you start with fixed shift, right? You select the category and you give it some name. You would mention the starting time as well as the end time, and you would also mention how long is your break hours. Just to make a note here, so this is required if your break is unpaid. So essentially you see that in this shift I have defined 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. which is 12 hours. Since I have selected unpaid break hour as 1 hour, the net payable hour shown here is 11 hours. And now you can select a list of staffs for whom this shift applies, and you can save it. Next, we'll look at how to configure rotational shifts. So fairly similar, you give a shift name, right? And as there are multiple shifts associated with a rotational shift, you would have to define the same things. You would have to call what, let's say the first shift is called. Here I'm naming it as shift 1. And you have to mention the start time and the end time. Similar to a fixed shift, you would also have to mention the unpaid break hours if it applies. And likewise, you have to define the other shift. So here I have defined 2 shifts. If you have shorter shift hours and more than one, you can also add another shift here, right? Now, just to make a small note here, that if you want your employees to mark 2 presence in one day, which is 2P, if there are 2 shifts, or if you want somebody to work 3 shifts and be able to mark their attendance, you have to enable this for your, for marking 3P, 2P and 3P. So once you enable this, both your lens and normal flows both will work. Like fixed shift, you can assign your next set of employees for whom this applies. You can save it. The third category is the open shift. As you would understand that it doesn't require a start and an end time. It needs the number of work hours to be clocked. So you name the shift and you just give the number of hours, and that's it. So here again, the concept of a paid or unpaid break, actually doesn't work, because even if somebody has gone for, let's say, 2 hours of break, end of the day, if they have not clocked these 8 hours, right, they would not be marked 8 hours. So, and if you have some policy around early exit, and fines around them, all of that will be applicable, right? So we do not define break hours here. We just define the work hours, and just like any other shift, you would now assign the staffs for whom this applies, and you would save it. So here in the shift setting page, you would see a summary of all the shifts you have configured, what are the shift timings, how many people they are assigned to, and so on. This is like a summary view, right? Just to summarize, we have fixed shift where you need to mention a start and an end time, and you have to mention the unpaid break hours if it applies. For rotational shift, you have to do it multiple times, as many shifts are there in your business. For open shift, you don't need a start and an end time. You just specify the number of hours, and again, break hours, like I said, is not applicable. Just to give you a small note here, that some of you have requested that we have designated break hours, like between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. This is not configurable on our system yet, but this will be available soon. Next, we will look at the policies around overtime and fines. So there are 4 categories, right? You have a late entry, early exit, and you have excess break and overtime, right? So right after shift setting, you go to automation rules. Why automation? Because these calculations are automated based on your configuration, right? So you set the rules for all these categories, right? and you just have to approve fine and overtime entries going forward, but all the calculations will be automated. Okay, so here I am configuring that the grace period for late entry is 15 minutes. I'll explain how it works, but right now we'll just look at the configurations. And you can select, like all applicable to all stuffs, or you can assign it to specific ones. Right? And then, yeah, you can assign it to specific people if you want, or assign to all, and enable rule. Right? Similarly, you can do the same for early exit. And excess break hours. It's fairly straightforward. You just have to give the time and who you want to assign to. If you want to do it all, you just move this toggle, or you apply to specific people as per your choice. So this is all about the configuration. Just to make a small note here, early OT is still not configurable on our system, but again, it will be available very soon. So how will all these settings apply, on the staff application? So for those of you who have been part of the system would know that we have one Android-based application which staffs can sort of access, right? And then we have the web application, which is more for the administration side of it. And we have the Lens application, which is again for facial recognition and attendance, right? So to talk about the experience, let me start with how will staffs see this, right? So on the home screen, they will get the option to punch in. If, so once you click punch in, the day starts. If your break automation is configured, then going forward, you will find two options, which is start break and punch out. And yeah, if you have clicked on start break, you would get the next, you would get the option of end break. And of course, after that, you will get a punch out option. If the attendance marking is on Lens, then for fixed and rotational shift, it's a normal marking, right? You show your face and you will get a green screen saying that attendance mark at so and so time. So this is for fixed shift and rotational shift. Because as a system, we have the reference that what is the start of the shift, what is the end of the shift, right? So based on this time, we can do all the other calculations. Now, when it comes to open shift, right, we don't have a time reference. We need to calculate the in and out, right? So once you have shown your face, you would get these two options. As a staff, you can either click punch in or punch out. So the first punch will only allow a punch in, first punch in the day. And then after that, you can do punch out, punch in as applicable. If your break automation is configured, then you would get four options: punch in, punch out, start break, end break. Again, the first punch of the day will only allow a punch in. So this is the experience on Lens. Now, on this slide, I would like to have your complete attention, because here I will explain the basics of how the calculations work on the PagarBook platform with all the automations in place, right? The first point here is all fines, OTs are calculated on gross pay and not CTC. So for example, if you have a staff whose name is Ramesh and his gross pay is 15,000, right? Whatever be the CTC after bonus, etc., you're not worried about that. Just the gross pay is 15,000, and you have a salary cycle of 28 days. So for example, if you have a month-wise salary cycle and you're in February, you have 28 days. So the wage rate per shift then stands at 15,000, which is the gross pay, divided by 28, which is 535.71. This is the first step. The second step is all per hour rates are calculated based on the current shift length where the employee is working. To give you an example, let's say Ramesh is allowed to work in 2 shifts rotationally where shift A is 10 hours long and shift B is 9 hours long, right? So for shift A, when the fine and the OT is calculated, we will take the per shift wage rate, which came to 535.71 here. We will divide it by 10 because the shift A is 10 hours long. And this is the net payable hours, by the way. So your per hour rate comes to 53.57. Now, if Ramesh works 1 hour 10 minutes extra, we will convert this per hour rate into minutes, which is divided by 60, and multiply it with 70, which is the total extra minutes worked. Now here it comes to 62.49. Now the same person, if worked 1 hour 10 minute extra OT in shift B, which is 9 hours long, right, the calculation would be slightly different. So we'll take the per shift wage rate, which is 535, we calculated here on gross pay. We'll divide it by 9 because the current shift is 9 hours. So my per hour wage rate is 59.52. Again, if the staff work for 1 hour 10 minutes extra, we would divide this per hour wage rate into minutes, which is by 60, and multiply it with the minutes additionally worked. Comes to 69.44, slightly different from the shift A, right? The third important point here is that all fines, OTs, are on a per minute basis and excludes the grace period you have configured, right? So let's say if you have configured 30 minutes as your grace period for late entry, till the 30th minute, no fines will be charged. But on the 31st minute, fine will be charged for all the 31 minutes. So just to summarize, your OT and fine is calculated on gross pay. The per hour rates are calculated on the current shift length, and everything is calculated on a per minute basis, excluding the grace period. We'll take an example and look at how fixed shift would work, right? So let's say you have configured a shift between 7 a.m. and 2 p.m. and you have an unpaid break hour of 1 hour. So your net payable shift is 6 hours. And let us assume that you have configured 15 minutes as grace period for all the automation rules. Now let's say an employee punches in at 7:10 a.m., which is 10 minutes later than the start time of the shift. To remind you, you have a grace period of 15 minutes. So essentially no fines would be charged. Now this employee starts the break at 12 noon, comes back at 1 p.m., which is exactly the number of hours you have configured for unpaid break, and then punches out at 2:35 p.m. So before the break, the employee worked for 4 hours 50 minutes. After the break, he has worked for 1 hour 35 minutes. In total logged work hours is 6 hours 25 minutes. Is there a late entry fine? No, because your grace period was 15 minutes and the employee entered within 10 minutes. So no fines. Excess break? No, because the employee has been good. He has come back within the stipulated hours. Early exit? No, your exit time was 2 p.m. Your staff has left at 2:35, right? So no early exit. Is there overtime? Yes. Your exit time was 2 p.m. The grace period was 15 minutes. So if the staff had left any time between 2 and 2:15, there would be no OT. However, since he has left after 35 minutes, you would get overtime for all the 35 minutes. A rotational shift would essentially work in a very similar way, just that there are certain nuances when it comes to a person assigned to multiple shifts. We'll have a look at that. So how multiple shifts work. To start with, yes, this works only for rotational shift, right? Not for fixed, not for open. And your multiple shift could be a continuous or a non-continuous shift. So when I say continuous, which means the end time of your first shift is equal to the start time of your second shift. As in this case, you have 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. as shift 1, and then you have 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. as the second shift. Non-continuous would mean that there is a reasonable gap between the two shifts, as in this case demonstrated here. You start at 8 a.m., end at 12 noon for the first shift, and the second shift is between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. Now, as a system, we have configured a buffer zone of plus minus 1 hour. If somebody wants to get 2 Ps, right, for attending both the shifts, that person would need to punch at least twice in this buffer zone. One would signify the punch out of shift 1 and the other would signify the punch out of shift 2. Punch in of shift 2, right? Now, how do we understand that now that you have punched in for a second time, is this for working overtime of the first shift or you have started the second shift? So for that, your next punch for punch out should be at least after the mid time of shift 2. Okay, so just to summarize here, for condition of 2P, you need at least 2 punch in the buffer zone, right? One would signify a punch out of the shift 1, second would signify a punch in of shift 2, right? And there needs to be at least 1 punch after the mid time of second shift. Why I am saying at least? So somebody might go on a break, right? So somebody might go on a break here, come back here, right? So essentially, when we look at the last punch of the day, that should come at least after the mid time of shift 2 for us to signify, hey, this is the punch out for the second shift and not a overtime, right? So yeah, so at least 1 punch after the second shift mid time, else it will be considered OT for first shift, but up to 6 hours, not more than that. I hope I'm clear here. Now, for non-continuous shifts, again, the concept is very similar. There is a buffer zone. So here, the buffer zone for second shift would start at 3 p.m. and this is the mid time of shift 2. So for 2 Ps, you need at least 1 punch after the start of shift 2's buffer zone. So from 3 p.m. onward, there should be at least 1 punch that would signify a punch in for the second shift. And similarly, there should be at least 1 punch after the mid time. So doesn't matter like here if you have in between taken a break, punched out, punched in again, right? But there should be 1 punch out after the mid time. So at least 1 punch after the second shift mid time, else it is considered OT for first shift up to 6 hours. Moving on, we'll look at how open shifts work. So let's say you have configured work hours as 7 and a break period of 30 minutes and all grace periods of 15 minutes. Now, user sometime in the day, let's say 7 a.m., somebody has punched in, starts break at 12 noon, ends break at 1 p.m. and punches out at 2:45. So here the person has worked for 5 hours. After break, he has worked for 1 hour 45 minutes. So total work hours log 6 hours 45 minutes, no fines. Why no fines? Because you have configured all the grace period as 15 minutes, right? So since the user has punched out 2:45 or after that, right, charge no fines. We'll see a second case where everything else remains same, but the user has punched out at 2:44, 1 minute more than the stipulated grace period. So here, the staff will be charged a fine for all the 60 minutes. Now, just to make a point here on our system, any shift that you configured has a maximum capping of 16 hours. So no shift can be more than 16 hours. In case of open shift, right, if you look at the last possible time when somebody can punch in for the day, assume it is, let's say, 11:59, right? And your shift hours is 16 minutes. So till the next day 4 p.m., right, which is 12 plus 4, 16 hours, we would allow the punch out for the previous day. Right? This is a very corner case where if somebody is marking their attendance of a 16 hours shift, but has started the day at 11:59, right before midnight. So even for that, we would allow that person to clock in 16 hours. So till next day 4 p.m., the employee is allowed to punch out. Yes, so that's it from our side. Thank you all.